So somebody who's in crisis, for the majority of people, that's a pretty heavy story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like the idea of trauma is also very heavy, you know. And you're right. The majority of people can feel the existential threat that's always around them, whether that's I'm not going to make this sale, or there's something's going to happen with the brokerage, or, you know, whether it's just simple life stuff like worrying about your child or your spouse. But the experience that traumatizes a child, where the ego comes online, when language comes into play, and when we split, that's always an arbitrary experience.
Welcome to Time-Tested Mastery Life Lessons Sell. Today's guest is Zac Russell, a facilitator who helps people experience more peace, presence, and contentment in their day-to-day life. Zac's work centers on a simple but powerful idea. A lot of what drains our performance in relationships isn't the situation in front of us, it's the story we attach to it. And when you can let go of the beliefs, narratives, and mental loops that keep you stuck, you create something most people never train: present moment awareness. Now, if you're in sales, leadership, or real estate, you already know the pressure is real. Rejection, conflict, uncertainty, high stakes conversations, and the constant urge to figure it out in your head. Zac's angle is different. Not motivation and not hype, but a way to operate with more clarity and calm so you can show up clean, listen better, and build trust without force. So the first question I have, Zac, for today's listeners, what led you to the work you're doing now, helping people live with more presence and the freedom that comes with it?
Well, great question. First of all, Mark, thanks for having me today. I really appreciate being here and chatting with you. So, you know, I'm an incarnate human being, just like the rest of us. I live, I have experiences, and I suffered exponentially when I was a lot younger than I am now. So that's kind of what led me to where I am today, a succession of events that I call the past, that I misidentified with, that I projected into the illusion of a future, and missed out completely on the experience of life for the majority of the time that I've been alive. And I kind of worked through that. I gained a lot of knowledge, which didn't do me any good. I figured out a lot of things, had a lot of experiences, and I came to the point where I adopted a methodology that I use now to help people transcend those limiting beliefs and to live an experience of life free, peaceful, and content. And I'm a byproduct of that work. So that's why I offer it to others, because I just think it's a necessity.
You're going to be sharing real life experience, things that you've gone through personally, and sort of the journey that you have evolved with, you know, so that you can help other people. Do you mind sharing a little bit personally about that situation? You know, and the reason that I say that is I've rarely met anyone that if they look back to their childhood, you know, or their younger life or early adult life, that didn't have struggles. I mean, I think that's pretty much a universal experience. And so can you share with the listeners today a little bit specifically about that story and what you went through?
I mean, the idea of struggles, yes, the majority of human beings experience struggles, but the very idea of a struggle is a construct of the mind based on the framework that we operate from, you know, based on the programming, which is the beliefs that we have that were ingrained in us in childhood. So there actually isn't any struggles objectively. There's only situations and circumstances and things to either do or not do. The issue is when we identify with the fact of a struggle. That's when things start to get tricky. And to your point, yes, in childhood, when our ego comes online, usually between ages 3 to 5, that's when language starts to form. That's when beliefs start to come. And that's when we have the idea of a self. When we make things about us, when we represent that through these belief structures, which are always maladaptive, they're always inaccurate emotions in reality, even though they feel real. And that kind of leads to the so-called struggles that we definitely experience subjectively throughout our life.
Wow, that's a fascinating idea. So let me see if I understand what you're sharing is that the experiences that we're having, the moment that we put the label on it, that it's a struggle, that's not the reality of it. That is our choosing. Is that what you're sharing?
It 95% of the way there. It's not even that it's our choosing necessarily, right? Because nobody chooses to suffer. Everybody wants
Mm.
to feel better. It's unconscious. So, yes, exactly. As soon as we label something, as soon as we make something about us, which comes from these scarcity, egocentric, maladaptive emotions from childhood, unconsciously, people don't aware. But as soon as we label that and we make it mean something and we believe something about it, that's where the illusion comes into play because now it's no longer objective. Now it's about us.
Mm.
And if it's about us, we're bound to suffer because that's what the ego is.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and that's, fascinating in the sense that I've worked with real estate salespeople and alongside real estate salespeople for 4 decades. And it is interesting the way that people describe how difficult, I mean, and they will use that phrase, how difficult the business is. And it sounds like you might sort of have some suggestions how they could relabel that or to rethink it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the problem if we relabel it, then it's kind of turns into a bit of a coping mechanism for something that's not real. And we can think about it all we want, we can gain more knowledge, but we can never actually solve something that's not real because by very definition, it's not real. So there's nothing we can do about it, right? The only
Right.
thing we can actually do is let go of that. And that's sort of what we do in my work. And that's kind of the idea of living present moment consciousness is the objectivity of now, which is all that actually exists. So when we let go of the stories, then the idea of becoming a realtor, being a realtor, selling homes and businesses, there's no difficulty behind that. It just is what it is.
Okay. Well, you talk a lot about creating peace and freedom. What does that look like for people that have not experienced it in the past? What suggestions would you have for them?
Awareness is the first thing, right? And acceptance is the second. The surrender kind of comes online with those two. But I mean, if you don't know, you don't know, right? So you
Mm.
can't be, there's no slight on that. If you think that the story of your life is actually the reality of it, then there's nothing you can do per se, because that's the story of your life. But when you realize that that's a story and the awareness, well, now you have a choice. Now you can let go. Now you can not misidentify with all of the labels.
If somebody has not been aware of the present moment, are there any particular exercises or thought processes that you guide people through?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not so much a thought process as it is an experience, right? So the methodology that I have, there's no studying, there's no writing, there's no things to think about. It's an experience that we have. So we go through a process where we become aware of the 40 or 50 maladaptive emotions people have been living by. Most people think it's about three or four. And that's the key because they think it's three or four emotions. And once we become aware that it's 40 or 50, all of a sudden the mind
Hmm.
expands. And now we can see what we couldn't previously see. And so from there, we let go of all of that through a very powerful declaration. And we create some amazing possibilities for our life. And the experience after that is peace and contentment, which is not to be reclusive or reluctant. It's to be okay with the way things are. And then from there, pursuing our love and our passion and our vocation.
Can you describe what that looks like when you bring a new client on or you bring a new person into your practice? What does that process look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's when human beings have had enough of the suffering, when they've hit the air quotes rock bottom per se, that's when a lot of people will take this work underway. And it basically looks like I basically build some context on the ego. Sometimes it depends on the human being and whether it's required or not. Sometimes the context helps a little bit to ease people who are a little bit afraid and anxious when they come into it. And then they can kind of calm down a little bit, get a little bit of understanding about sort of the psychopathy of the mind, which doesn't do any good for the experience because it's more analyzing, but it's kind of a good bridge. And then from there, we deal with a recent situation or circumstance that somebody's had that really upset them. Everybody's got that. Most people have many. Uh, and
Yeah.
then we look at a succession of events of the past, and then we go back, we see that the early childhood memory, usually when the ego comes online, age 3 to 5, is similar to the experience that they were traumatized by and bothered by recently. We go through the emotions, and the mind can then see that the emotions of when they were a 3 to 5 year old are exactly the same, like literally identical as the emotions
Right.
at this recent event that they were triggered by. That expands the mind and essentially softens the ego to a point of awareness, which is what I sort of talked about a little bit earlier. And now it's like, oh my God, it was the air quotes aha moment, right? And the mind is expanded wide open. Now we let go of everything. And the metaphor is just putting down a heavy backpack, right? So if you're walking down the
Mm.
street carrying a backpack full of weight, what do you do if you don't want to carry it anymore? You just take it off your shoulders, put it down, keep walking, and then
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
gone.
I, I've shared with people that I work with all the time that problems are like a bag of groceries. They get heavy if you hold them on the time. There's nothing wrong with setting them down. You can always come back and pick them up a little bit later. So, I like that.
Absolutely.
And I love your analogy about, a backpack. You were talking about what happens when you drink 5 shots of tequila. I need to hear that.
The tequila analogy is if you drink 5 shots of tequila, the chances are good you're going to be intoxicated. And
Hmm.
from that point, now there's a biological function and a framework in place, right? Ethanol's been taken into the body and assimilated, and there's been a factor that's happened. So there's nothing that you can do about that other than have your system assimilate and excrete that and deal with it, right? So it's the same kind of thing when somebody's triggered. There's nothing you can do about that in the moment. They're triggered. Now the fight or flight has to calm down. The animal, the human being, has to get away from the threat, and the nervous system has to recalibrate and rebalance. So it doesn't matter what you say to somebody in that moment. There's really nothing they can do to just let it go or to,
Mm.
just don't be upset or just do this in the moment. So that's kind of the analogy of the fight or flight with the tequila and how it's the triggers that we have that upset us and that take us out of the experience, take our peace away. You can't deal with those in the moment, just like you can't deal with being drunk on tequila in the moment.
Right. Well, and in my mind right now, I'm thinking of a handful of people that I have run across recently that when I observe what they're experiencing, it looks like they're suffering, it looks like they're stuck, and they know they're stuck, or they know that they're not happy, but they don't necessarily feel the ability to take a corrective action. So you mentioned, I think, a little bit earlier that when people, there's some event that is just sort of that blow up event, can you share, not using anyone's name, of course, but, an experience of somebody that came to you in crisis and what it looked like when they worked themselves through it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always an arbitrary experience, right? So somebody who's in crisis, for the majority of people, that's a pretty heavy story, right?
Hmm.
Just like the idea of trauma is also very heavy. And you're right. The majority of people can feel the existential threat that's always around them, whether that's I'm not going to make this sale, or there's something's going to happen with the brokerage, or whether it's just simple life stuff like worrying about your child or your spouse. But the experience that traumatizes a child, where the ego comes online, when language comes into play, and when we split, that's always an arbitrary
Mm.
experience, right? So mothers, mammalians, and vertebrates, like a bear as an example, they hide their children away. They protect those children until they're neurologically developed, and then they live their lives. Like a mother bear will maul a father bear if it tries to do anything to the cub.
Right.
And so humans, because we have egos, because we have narcissistic structures and frameworks and selves, we don't do what the mother bear does. So arbitrary experiences. The child breaks a figurine. The child hears mom and dad yelling in the kitchen. The child experiences any kind of emotions, which are just sensations designed to represent the experience. But when they experience those emotions, because they have sentience and they can think, they make that about them. And then they need to feel safe. So, as an example, they hear mother and father yelling. Now, by naturally, when the baby cub experiences trauma or something, it runs to the mother. When the baby human experiences trauma or something, it runs to the mother. But there's the problem is when it hears the mother yelling, it has a disconnect because it wants to run to the mother, but because the mom's yelling, it feels unsafe.
Hmm.
And that's when the arbitrary experience comes online and the child splits. That's when the abandonment, the unlovability, the emotions start to form. And that's when the child does anything that it can to be safe. So that's the arbitrary experience. And from that point on, depending on the rest of the child's life, which usually follows in a similar fashion when you have parents and guardians that are that way, it turns into a version of a narcissist. But it always boils down to that arbitrary experience that dictates the rest of the human being's life.
What you're sharing there, about those experiences, and those emotions,
Yeah.
and pretty clearly, a lot of the things that people are experiencing in the present is not what's really happening in the present. It's something that is either happened in the past that they're bringing forward. Real estate examples of that would be, I lost the last three listings, and so I'm apprehensive of this particular one that's in front of me. Or I had a client that that didn't choose me the last time, and I'm afraid that I'm going to have that same experience this time. And so they're bringing a lot of baggage into the present moment. And I know that you work with people on awareness. So are there any tools or exercises that you could suggest to people that would get them to focus on the present moment?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you're right. I would say that most people are not actually living in the present moment. Now, all we have is right now. But if you're lost in your mind, walking around talking to yourself about what happened yesterday and projecting it into what's going to happen tomorrow, then you're not actually here. And I mean, that's evident, right? A lot of people drive to
Mm-hmm.
work and they don't even know how they got there. They get to work and they look back in, oh my God, how did I get there, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
that's a whole other story, but that's the subconscious anatomy of the mind driving the car that you learned 30 years ago. And that's you lost in your head, thinking about your boss, thinking about that meeting with the client, thinking about whatever it's going to be and projecting from the way that things were yesterday. So to answer your question, tools, I don't give tools or advice or anything like that because it doesn't do any good for the experience, right? That's just coping mechanisms, setting goals, trying to be good enough when you actually feel like you're not, are all less than ideal modalities that just perpetuating the narrative that you aren't good enough or that you are suffering or that things are not going to be okay, right? So we have to let go of that. We have to become aware of it and we have to let go of it. Otherwise, all we're doing is taking what the past and those maladaptive emotions and moving them ahead into the future. We're still metaphorically in the prison. We're just making it a little bit nicer with, 300 thread count sheets and some artwork and soft music.
Yeah. Yeah. So what does peace look like?
Well, peace just looks like being okay with the way that things are, not being lost in the mind, right? Not ruminating constantly, not having chaotic thoughts being generated by the psyche all the time. Like most people have thought patterns that the mind is like a garbage disposal. Like it just pumps out thoughts. It's
Yeah.
valuable for what it is, and it's very powerful. But when it gets misused, which is 98% of humanity, then it just turns into a jambalaya of thoughts that we latch onto, that we dedicate our resources to. Kind of like the example of thinking about your day as you're driving to work, instead of just driving to work in the moment and actually experiencing that moment, right? So, peace in that hypothetical scenario would be awareness in the moment. It would be doing the work to let go of all of that stuff and then driving to work content, not upset about somebody that's cut you off, not concerned that you're 15 minutes late, not worrying about the fact that you didn't close the garage door before you left. Just in the moment, experiencing the sun or the rain, watching the trees pass, observing, living.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine that a lot of people relate to what you're sharing because I know from my own personal experience that I've lived in my head a whole lot of my life. And so, exactly what you're describing, driving somewhere, I'm thinking about where I'm going, or where I've been, or what's going to happen next week or the next vacation or the last problem. I have a lot of things that go through my head in the middle of my day, so I'm not aware of where I'm at in that particular moment. And it does take a little bit of discipline and effort on my part to bring myself back into that place where I'm actually present. And I can't remember exactly who the author was, but the book was called The Power of Now. And I remember reading The Power of Now, and it's like, why right now nobody has a gun to my head. I'm in a safe place. There's no threat to anything going on in my life right now. And why don't I feel the reality of this moment, which is I'm perfectly safe?
Yeah, that's the ego,
Yeah.
because the ego is never safe, right? The ego is the same thing we talked about earlier with the baby bear and the mother bear analogy, and the guardian or parent and the infant child that hears them arguing. That is a emotional framework and then a thought pattern that gets stuck on. And that pattern, even though it's unconscious, runs through the entirety of our life unless we bring it to awareness and let it go. So all of those different malformations all present slightly different for different human beings. But that's why one just doesn't feel safe when they are, right? Like you can tell yourself, no one has a gun to my head. I'm sitting here, I'm protected, I'm safe. And still it doesn't feel that way at all because
Mhm.
it's unconscious. The anatomy of that and the biology of that in this organism that they call is in fight or flight.
How can people get in touch with you if they want to do the work that and the experience that you go through with your process?
The easiest way is just my link tree, which is linktree slash my name, Zac Russell.
Okay,
They
awesome.
can click on that, and there's my socials on there and some information on the methodology as well as the way to contact me too. I'm going to be having an audio course coming out very soon, which I think is going to be really valuable for a lot of people. It's essentially the session and the methodology without me. So the value in it is for people that are at a certain stage in their life. It can be a guided process of letting go. The disadvantage to it is that there's no mirror and there's no, uh, which is really what, in my experience, the majority of people need, because most of us have been gaslit so hard our entire existence that we're just addicted to victimhood and validation, and it's really hard to let that go without some assistance.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think coaches can guide you in places that you wouldn't normally see. I mean, you can't see the problems that you're facing a lot of times without somebody on the outside sharing that with you. So, for people that have gone through this process with you and, they achieve some healing or some peace with it, is there any examples of boundaries or guidelines that you would suggest for people so that they can stay on course when life gets busy?
Yeah, sure. So everybody that does this work has the experience of present moment consciousness. What does that mean? It means they're free, they're peaceful, and they're content, as we were talking about earlier. Now, that's not to say that there's still things in life that, could potentially trigger them, or things that they, would rather have a different way, preferences per se. But the idea of even putting up boundaries means that you feel like you don't have any, right? So if I have to think mentally and come up with boundaries for things, for my coworkers, for my spouse,
Mhm.
for anything, then that actually means that that's not the experience that I'm having. So it's kind of nuanced, but once you're free, then boundaries aren't a thing because you operate integrously through the world and you operate in the moment. So there's no more story of needing boundaries. Like, as an example, you wouldn't feel this way about a coworker or a supervisor or a boss or a broker. You wouldn't need to set boundaries up with Mike. You would just have the integrity to realize and to see that Mike is not operating efficaciously, And now you don't have a story. It's subtle, but it's a very, very different experience.
Yeah. I recognized a long time ago is that there are people that come into my life that I don't have to engage with. I certainly don't have to. And that's a beautiful thing. So, I really appreciate everything that you've shared today and really am interested in the work that you're doing. So I want to encourage everyone to reach out to you, Zac. Is there one thing that you would want everybody that is listening to the show today to have as a takeaway?
Yeah, awareness and acceptance, right? If you're not okay with the way things are, you're going to suffer. Now, that's not to say that you don't wish things were differently or you're not committed to making things differently, but it's a very different framework, right? So acceptance is really the key, and awareness. I tell a lot of the things I tell people, you've got that fancy iPhone there, right? Hit that memo record button when you're talking to somebody and record it, and then listen back to it later and try and stay present when you listen to it, and see what you're saying. As we speak, so we create. So the words that come out of your mouth really have a dominant factor in the experience of your life. So become aware of the things that you say, and then you can have little moments there where you can become aware and you can let things go. But at the end of the day, we don't teach this stuff. We're not taught to be free and peaceful and content. We're taught actually the polar opposite. So it's really, really challenging for a lot of people. So I would just say sign up for the session and the coaching. Download the course when it's available.
I'm glad I asked that last question because that was gold right there, Zac. I appreciate it. Yeah. So if you got value out of today's episode, here's your assignment. Pick one moment this week, one call, one meeting, one tough conversation, and practice presence on purpose. Not perfect, but intentional. Notice the story your mind wants to tell and come back to what's real in front of you. Zac, thanks for bringing a message that cuts through the noise and brings people back to clarity. And to our listeners, if this episode helped you, share it with someone who's living in their head and paying for it in their business, their relationships, or their peace. And if you haven't yet, follow Time Tested Mastery Life Lessons Cell so you don't miss the next conversation. I'm Mark Dolan. See you next time.